Thank you everyone for joining. We're going to talk today about untangling IT compliance and the organizational shift to proactive compliance, and a bit of an introduction about myself. For those who don't know, my name is Matthew Davis. I'm responsible for the planning, execution, and delivery of our GRC and cyber applications at SureCloud. Before coming to SureCloud, I worked in GRC technology and IT risk assurance for 7 years, working for PwC and Deloitte. I've done a lot of GRC implementations, working with stuff like RSA Archer, ServiceNow, Auris, IBM Open Pages. The thing I've really helped customers and clients to do is take these tools and help take that GRC framework and optimize and kind of really make these processes much more effective for them. So it's not only how they can take their processes, but it's how they can make it much more effective within their organization. The other thing is there is going to be a Q&A at the end. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat window. I'm sure Layla will ping as well and put it in. But if you've got any questions, do put them in the chat window. We'll have some time to go through them at the end. Okay, so let's start with challenges. Well, what are the challenges for today's security and compliance professionals? Well, I think the first one is making sure business is done securely and quickly. Ultimately, as compliance professionals, you don't want to be a blocker to business, but you want to make sure that things are being secure, compliant, and things are going well. With digitization of businesses, this is really a difficult line to tread because ultimately your business wants to digitize or maybe in the process of it. And at the same time, you don't want to introduce new security risks and compliance issues. You want to do this in a secure way, but also making sure you're enabling business to happen efficiently. And the other thing is there is lots and lots and an ever-increasing number of compliance requirements that you need to deal with. And these are coming from multiple different sources. And there's a lot of overlap. So how do you bring those compliance requirements together in an efficient way? It's a challenge. It's bringing them together so you can get on top of those requirements and make it much, much easier. And inevitably, you want to simplify the compliance testing and evidence collection because it is a constant issue for the business when they're being asked lots and lots of times for, please take this control. I'm asking for the same thing over and over again. And you end up with a lot of audit fatigue and people not really buying into what compliance do and not seeing them as an enabler and kind of a thing that they need in order to do business well. So let's kind of talk through how this gets so complicated. A lot of organizations start with something like, I don't know, ISO 27001, the NIST CSF, it could be anything. And what often happens is they take that, what started off as a fairly simple requirement and something changes within the business. You end up with new goals or the business changes its goals. And inevitably, when that happens, things often get more complicated. And the first thing is, so say the business changes, you win new contracts. Well, your new contracts may mean that you go into new jurisdictions where there's new regulatory requirements that you need to adhere to. You also may have new things that your suppliers say, actually, we want you to be ISO 27001 compliant. We want you to have SOC 2 report. There's many things that can be added to you here, which as your business evolves or changes, there's new contracts which lead to more regulatory requirements that you need to deal with. People come in, so people leave, have new ideas and thoughts on how they want to do things. They add new frameworks or standards that they've used in a previous workplace and say, actually, we want to do this as well. The thing to note here is this is often additive. So if you think about it, a lot of the time, nobody's going, actually, do we need all these additional controls? Are they the right thing to be doing? We're just adding to them over and over and over again. Other thing that you want to do is increase maturity. So again, there's more regulations and standards. You may want to make what you've got more fit for purpose. And as that happens, it makes things more complex, more things are added. There are more requirements to put on the business. And again, it's additive. And finally, there's regulatory change. So even to stay where you're at, there will be changes in the regulations, but inevitably when you win new business, there will be new regulations and new things that you have to deal with. based on the locations where you are. And if the business changes, ultimately it's the same thing. There is, and this isn't an exhaustive list, but things will change. And as things change, more and more requirements are added. So as your organization evolves, you end up with many, many more compliance requirements to deal with. It can very quickly start to look something like this. And again, there's a combination of regulations, frameworks, standards in here to adhere to. And what's the issue with this? Well, inevitably, they are managed interdependently. A lot of the time, you have different teams who are working on them. So if you take GDPR, CCPA, that might be the privacy team, your legal team who are working on it. You may have people in information security and audit working on PCI, ISO. You might have your cloud security team working with the CCM. And the problem is the organization are being asked from many different places to deal with these things. And there's a lot of them that are managed in different areas of the business. Often it ends up being different in each country, location, or business unit, depending on what they've adopted. And you end up with this web of lots of different things that are done all across the business. And then this means that your business stakeholders complain about audit fatigue. They say, well, I'm being asked 5 times for the same control. Why am I being asked for it? They don't really differentiate the difference between what the source of the request is from. They're just like, why am I being asked to do the same thing over and over again? It feels like I've already been asked 3 times this year for it. And there's a lot of duplication and overlapping requirements. A lot of these standards, frameworks, and even regulations have the same core things at the beginning of, well, at the kind of the requirements that are asked of them. And a lot of silos appear within your compliance program. So you end up with pockets of things done in different places. And then some end up being strategic, more important than others. But again, a lot of this is additive and we're not taking them away. Let's just walk through an example of this. And what we're going to start with is an ISMS control from ISO 27002. And we're going to look at an example around policy because it's quite easy to identify duplications in policy controls. But if we look at, before we go into each of these, essentially the set of controls are going to ask us in some way or other that you've got an information security policy that's documented, reviewed, signed off, and communicated to a group of stakeholders. So if we take the ISO one, it's saying it's documented, reviewed by management, published and communicated, but it's talking about internal and external parties. We take NIST, it's saying there's a set of policies that's established and communicated. We take PCI, again, publish, maintain and disseminate your security policy. And then we take COBIT here, which is talking about just define and communicate policies and procedures. Again, this is quite easy to pick up because this is quite a standard control and it's to find in all these standards. So you can actually quite easily say, we want to take one and kind of align this, but it's not always as easy as this. And when you've got many of these to adhere to, what you'll notice is different language, different format, different levels of detail, and they're almost identical, but not the same asks. So that makes it challenging. And again, this one's quite easy, but there are other examples where it's a lot harder to understand where all of these overlapping requirements are. But you can see as a business user or even a compliance team, we're asking for the same thing all the time. Ultimately, this can be one control that can meet these many requirements. So how do we address these overlapping requirements? Well, there's a lot of things to manage, and most of the time, as I said, this has been an additive process where you've ended up with quite a lot of things and it's not been rationalizing. And the answer really is to baseline your controls. And if we say, what are baseline controls? Well, baseline controls are a set of controls that are mapped to your internal and external requirements that you want to meet. And what that will allow you to do is, if we take that policy control, is have one single policy control rather than 4 or 5. And when you're testing it, you're taking the worst case across them all, and then saying, actually, this is the standard, the policy control we want to meet. It meets all these requirements. And when you're asked for that evidence, it's one single control that you're managing across the business and not 7 or 8 versions of the same thing. So how does this help? Well, I mean, the first thing it allows you to do is to simplify the mandate by reducing the number of controls. Obviously, you don't want lots of controls. You want to reduce them. You want to have a standard set of controls that map to the requirements, so you're kind of reducing them. The second one is you create a consistent format and language across the control base. So when the business see those controls, it's very clear what a control looks like, the level of detail they expect. So it's standardized, and you're not having each standard giving you a different thing that they have to look at and review. This allows you to do the test one control to satisfy many requirements, which ultimately allows you to be a lot more proactive and reduce that testing and evidence collection burden. Because when you reduce the number of controls, you simplify it, it really allows you to kind of move to a more proactive approach that actually we are dealing with our standard set of security controls. They're baseline to all the things our organization needs to meet. And when we test and collect evidence for them, we're being much more proactive because we're meeting many of our requirements throughout the year. So you can do ongoing self-assessments, you can be much more on top of it, rather than trying to have 4 or 5 different audits or 7 or 8 throughout the year to make sure you're meeting each of these requirements. And when you're getting that evidence, it makes it much, much easier. So we're going to stop there, and we're just going to have a bit of time for a poll question. So just pull that across. So what we're going to be doing here is there's going to be a poll. I'm going to keep this open for a bit as I go through the next set of slides. But is your organization planning on implementing baseline controls? It's yes or no, or don't know. But if you already have, obviously say yes, would be very useful. And we'll go through kind of the results at the end. Okay, so now once you understand that actually we need to simplify that testing, we need to reduce the amount of controls, what is an approach to really set up a baseline controls? Well, there's 4 real options here. And the first one is build your own set. This gives you the most highly tailored option to your organization, and it's the most specific. But there are some things you have to think about before you go down this approach. Is, do you have the skills in-house to do this? So do I have the people who can do all that mapping, standardize those controls? Do I have the time? And do I have the resource to maintain this? Because you won't have something that you were working off. So when things change, you will have to figure that out yourself and unpick it. So there are for, I guess, smaller organizations or more resource, where you've got more resource conscious, you need to think about, actually, yes, we could do that, but are we in the right place? You could pay for a consultancy firm or contractors to do it. So they can, if they understand your business well, you could do this much quicker. You can scale up resource to do it. But again, similar concerns is, are we going to be able to be handed over a framework that we understand, that's embedded in the business, that makes sense? And then at the same time, the costs involved with this. And finally, maintenance of this. So yes, you might get all singing, all dancing framework, but inevitably you are going to have to maintain this. And do you have the skills in-house to do that? You can buy an off the shelf. So there are technology and vendors that exist where you can actually buy, and they're very customizable. Some of them, like the UCF, I know NIST do some of this, but you don't buy that, where they're baselined against many different kind of frameworks that you can choose, and you can build a control framework from that you can take advantage of. Or you can leverage a free source. So again, NIST, do a mapping to other ones. You can use the secure control framework. There's many of them out there, but ultimately you have to start somewhere. And I think starting with something like leveraging free source, at least to understand it, or getting an off-the-shelf set or a consultant to help you, is the easiest way to get you going. And then you can start to think, how can I kind of adopt that and get it into my program? So if we look at practical steps to adopt a baseline control set, I think the first thing you need to think about is, do we have a clear message from senior leadership that this is something we want to do? Because fundamentally, this is going to change the way that your organization manages controls. Because at the moment, you are going to have probably a lot of disparate sources and things that you're doing that you need to bring together. So you need senior buy-in that we're going to do this, understand that there will be a short to medium term pain to deliver this kind of program, but there is a buy-in that this is the right thing for the organization to do, and this is something we're working towards. The other thing to think about here is defining the scope. So is it realistic to say, actually, we're going to do everything at once? So practically, you probably want to say, what are the 4 or 5, or maybe less, key things that we want to bring together because they are most business critical. So you select those appropriate regulations, frameworks, and standards to define a scope of what the program should do. And again, it might just be 2 or 3 that you start with and display that it's working and you've got these controls and you're really making it easy for the organization, and evolve it. So it's be realistic of what you can expect. The second one here is, the third one, sorry, is develop your organization's policies and procedures and standards to make sure that they can support this kind of program. Changes in the way that you do the testing, how you review controls, it would be a much more centralized approach. And at this point, it's implement the appropriate controls. So what is the method that you've taken to build and adopt that baseline control set? So if you've taken a free source and then adapted it for your organization, ultimately here you'd be implementing the appropriate controls that you've met for the scope that you've agreed. And then you'd be moving into how you can test them. But this is where you start to see the most value to the business. Yes, we've reduced the number of controls, but where the business will start to see value is you've now got a baseline set of controls that allow you to kind of much easier reduce the testing burden. You can then look at how you're reviewing them in a more consistent way. And when you're improving those controls and making changes to them, it's rolled out across the entire business in a much more proactive way that you're keeping on top of them. That then moves into, you can, because those controls are standardized, you can look at agreeing and defining metrics to monitor controls. So it's making it a lot easier to go, actually, what we want to do is we've got standard controls that we can then start to use technology, or we're using kind of people metrics where they can populate them to monitor controls and look at things like continuous control monitoring or proactive measures to see actually how are these controls operating throughout the year, and we're not waiting for ad hoc testing cycles to review them. So how can SureCloud help? One of the things to think about here is we are framework agnostic. We support many different frameworks out there for baseline control sets, such as Secure Control Framework. We have a partnership with the UCF, which we integrate with if you've got the data, the ISF as well. We also allow you to directly map to frameworks such as like CSA, CIS, NIST, etc. And you can take and pick any of those control frameworks, or you can add your own. And at that point, you can edit that. You can tailor those controls to your organization if you import them or you're pulling your own in. You can then deploy controls against operational areas. So you have that standard set of controls and you manage against your business processes, your IT assets, and you can test them locally. You can then, when you test them, you get a single view of those controls. So I can see how my controls are operating in our geographical locations, but then how that rolls up to a single view for potentially the UK here. Then see a central source of truth for all of our controls. So I can see where we're failing. So I can actually say, actually, this control is failing in 2 areas. And we can translate those results into any regulation and standards. So if you've got mappings into those regulations and standards, you can quite easily go, here is our controls, here's how they map into the regulations and standards, and then we can report on them that way. So it gives us that view of those single set of controls, how they perform across the organization, and then how they're mapped back to each of the regulations and standards that you need to manage as an organization. I'm going to take a second there just to close the poll, and we're just going to review the poll results. So the results are inevitably, most people are, well, all people are going to be looking to either implement a baseline control set or already on with it. So from the results, that's everyone that on the call is saying that it's something they'd want to do. I mean, look, the benefit to your organization is huge. I know it is quite a big task and there's a lot to do, but in the long run, by doing this, you can get a lot of value as an organization. So I think inevitably, like, it is a senior level buy-in, but from doing it, you can really simplify the evidence collection and testing burden on your organization. So what we're going to do now is we're going to drop into a bit of a demo and show you around how SureCloud. So one of the things that we're going to look at very quickly is we're going to talk through how you can scope your control frameworks and controls, how you can then implement, deploy, and test your controls with ease, and then move into how we update and roll out automatic control updates, and then look at how you can define automated indicators to manage them. And then we'll kind of go through at the end some key takeaways before wrapping up with some questions. One second, I'm just going to pull over my secondary screen. Okay, so as an organization, one of the first things that you can do is we can view compliance as an overall. We can see our overall view of total compliance, compliance by processes, and we can see how this drops down into how our maturity is as an organization and where we're at. The other thing we can then do is, as I said, the big thing here is we've got a centralized control library, which is an organization. There we go. It's probably doing live demos, just give it a second. What we can do here is you can import controls directly from a central database. As I said before, we partner with the Secure Controls Framework, so you can take any of their controls that they have baselined against many different regulations and standards, and you can easily go in and pull over any of these reg standards into your framework. You can then select the appropriate control domains that are suitable that you want to do, and that will then pull over a set of controls that meet those requirements. So you can easily scope your framework and set it up using a baseline control framework. We also provide things like direct mappings to like ISO 27001, 27002, the NIST CSF. So you don't have to use a baseline control framework. You can easily scope controls into your organization very, very quickly. The other thing that we do, which is always a challenge with these kind of control frameworks, is actually if we look at the publishing control here, you can see that there may be some changes between the controls. So we will tell you when a control changes. So these baseline control frameworks change quite often. And what we allow you to do is tell you the differences between them. So we can see between the version that I've put in here, which is the one from last year, to the latest version today, there's been a bunch of changes around additional requirements added to it, and some changes in the number of some of the citations that are referenced. If that's something I want to import into my organization, I hit update, and then it will automatically pull that latest version of the control into my organization. And we allow you, as I said, to manage controls on 2 levels. This is an organizational control. So this control is set here for the organization. This is an instance of the control that I can then manage any area of the business. So I can create operational copies for assets and processes. This is the baseline control for all of the kind of the example that we were talking about before. So as you can see here, we've got overall testing statuses, descriptions, and we can see this maps into ISO 27002 and meets that 5.1.1 requirement. And we can see mappings to the citations here. We can set a target maturity for the organization of what level that we're looking to meet. So there's some implementation guidance of where we're at and what we're currently working towards. We can document any test procedures, so any design, operating, or self-assessment guidance. I'll come back to the test in a second, but we can create operational copies that I'll show you how simply that can be done. And we can also link this into our policies, so we have a single view of how our controls are meeting our internal and external requirements. We can easily drop into a control test, where users can be regularly automatically notified of when they need to do a test. So we can create these on a control frequency, and the user can then come in, document any findings, tell them what the operating test result was, upload any evidence, and submit it. And if there's any actions you want to add, you can hit add actions here. And as I said, you can quite easily deploy controls. So one of the things we can do is we can easily scope the controls from the control library that I would like to deploy and operationalize for each of my assets or processes. So I've pulled in these 3 controls here, and this links to the control library, where I can pull in any of the controls that exist within the control library. So I can go through any of them and select whichever ones I want. I can then say what targets, so what I want to deploy them against, so business units in this case. Select the appropriate users if I've got a set of standardized users that I want to manage this. And then I can confirm and deploy them, and then it will go away and create those controls and automatically link them back to the control. The other thing that we've worked really hard on is really simplifying when you make changes to these controls. So in a lot of cases, you may change the control description. So let's just add a tester here. And what that does is it picks up that the change has happened and is actually allowing me to notify and tell the local control owners that there's been a change. And I can make as many changes as I want before pushing that out. So once I hit notify, what that will do is it will tell all of my local control owners there's been a change. And then we can directly track each of those changes and make sure they track their adoption of them, so they're accepting them, and everyone's running on the latest version of the control. But you can also time this so it's not breaking apart your kind of testing cycle, so you're not kind of changing the controls mid-testing cycle. So you can be clever where you do this, making it much, much easier, giving you that end-to-end control management lifecycle. The final thing that I wanted to cover before we go back and talk through some additional things are our indicators tracker. So one of the things that we have been working on to really take those controls is how we can much more proactively monitor controls. So what we're doing here is easily setting up, and we can do this now to any external data source. So we can integrate to data sources and review data, and then not have to store it as a thing. It's temporary stored while we review it and run some rule sets over it. So in this case, I'm integrating. So I'm doing a capture method, which is calculated, which is integrating to an external source of testing data, of training data on attestations. So I'm looking for where anything I want to say where our organizational policy attestation is overdue by 15 days. So anything less than 0, I don't want anyone doing this, is good. And anything more than or equal to 1 is bad. So we don't want anyone to be meeting this. So I can select through a simple thing that you can set up yourself, any data source, and then select some filters of what I'm looking for. So I'm looking for a status that contains overdue, and the overdue days is greater than 15. So what that's telling me is that it's over 15 days, and actually I've got 583 people in my organization that are not meeting that. And I'm looking for a unique ID, a count of which employees aren't doing it. So there's actually 553 unique employees as well across all the training that have not met it. What I want to then do is say how often I want to be checking that. So how often do I want to pull that data from that source system and understand it? So I could be looking for, this is a monthly metric. We want to be tracking it every month. I'd like to start this from today, and I don't want this to end. I want no end date on this. And then can just confirm how often that I'm happy with it and make sure it's okay. When I hit activate, what it will then go and do is every single month, it will retrieve that information. You could do this daily as well. It retrieves it and it gives me a view of the data of exactly where it is. I can quite easily see as well where the source data is and which of the things has failed. So it's very clear. Here's the ones that failed, and there's the ones that I need to look at. So just to jump back to our presentation, what we walked through there is how you can scope your control frameworks and controls, then how you can implement, deploy, and test your controls at organizational level or at instances of the control, like in business units or assets or processes, how you can update and roll out automated control updates, and then really how you can be much more proactive and define automated indicators of how you can proactively monitor controls on an ongoing basis. So what are the key recommendations here? Well, I mean, the first one is don't reinvent the wheel. There are many to frameworks to simplify your IT requirements. Like I say, I really like the secure control framework. NIST does this, but you can create an overarching framework very, very easily and really start to reduce the number of controls that you have as an organization. You can then move that into kind of how you reduce the number of mundane and repetitive tasks, because once you have that standardized control set, you really can use technology, but technology is not the only way. You can then just say, actually, when we test that control and we're collecting evidence on a control, that meets the entire organization. So when I'm asked for evidence for any of our audits and any of our requirements, it's much, much easier to do because I'm not asking every single time. I'm just going into the system, single source of truths. I can see exactly the controls that I need to look at and how I can simplify that testing strategy. And finally, once you've standardized those controls, you can proactively monitor them. Well, once your controls are in place, you're able to keep them up to date and keep them on top of them. You can say, actually, I'm going to proactively monitor my controls. I'm going to integrate to our critical IT systems, and I'm going to actively look at that data in real time. So thank you for listening, everyone. I guess, have we got any questions? And I'll have a quick look in the chat window here. So I think the first question I've got here is, what do we need to in place to start to implement baseline controls? I think the first thing that I would take from that is senior level buy-in. Ultimately, you need to get them to buy into it to understand the value of it. It is very, very difficult to kind of build this program without having a senior level buy-in. The other thing is making sure all your business stakeholders are on board. So this is going to be a big change for them. But what may seem like a short-term pain or medium-term pain, you can really start to say, get them on board, understand the value in it. So they really say, actually, this is going to make my life a lot easier. And yes, there will be a lot of work, but ultimately I'm not going to be dealing with 9 compliance requirements. I'm going to be simplifying to one set that I know what I manage, and it's very clear what I'm doing and keeping on top of. And the other thing is skills. I would say you do need the right skill set in order to set this framework up. Either you do it in-house or you work with a partner, but you will need the right people to kind of get that framework up and running. So the other question I've got is, what is a realistic timeline to implement a baseline control set? So as long as you have the kind of skills in place, so some of the prerequisites, so you've agreed a scope, and again, I would try and keep it fairly small. So what are the critical things that we require the most time, that we're audited on the most often? Agree a scope. Again, you've got senior buy-in. I think you're looking at 6 to 12 months to really, first of all, get the controls written. And again, I'm talking as a whole thing, but you've got those controls documented properly. And then how you start to embed them may take 1 or 2 testing cycles. So I would give yourself 6 to 12 months and then be realistic of, like I say, what scope that you want to do and how you can build that out over time. You don't have to bite everything off at the beginning. I would suggest, again, you stick to the things that you're being asked for the most. And then once that's done, you then start to add to it and then really simplify that framework over the 1, 2, 3 year period. So there isn't any other questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to move on to the final bit. So like I say, feel free to get in touch at SureCloud, reach out to us on any of the social media channels there. My email address is here if you've got any questions. I'm more than happy to talk about this. There's my LinkedIn there. We do have 2 other things coming up. So there is our monthly cyber threat briefing that's happening, I think, at the end of this week. So there's a link there. And next week, I'm actually going to be doing a presentation, another one of these webinars on continuous compliance and why it's key to your organization. So if you'd like to join that, again, feel free to register for that as well. So thank you very much for listening. I appreciate everyone for joining today. Thank you.